The fascination with ancient Egypt began much earlier than most people imagine. Think about this, Cleopatra's time is actually closer to our modern world than to the age when the pyramids were built. That shows just how incredibly old Egyptian civilization really is. It lasted for thousands of years, so long that even its own great moments seem far apart in time. Our story of people being captivated by Egypt starts in ancient times themselves. During the days of the Roman Empire, the Romans were the first Europeans to truly fall under Egypt's charm. Their interest in Egypt mixed both political motives and genuine curiosity. Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony both became deeply involved with Cleopatra VII, who represented the power and mystery of her ancient kingdom. When Rome took control of Egypt in 30 BCE, it didn't just conquer the land, it also absorbed its culture. Egyptian symbols were shipped to Rome, obelisks decorated city squares, coins showed sphinxes, and Egyptian art was copied in Roman style. Rome wasn't only ruling Egypt, it was showing it off, using Egyptian culture to prove its power. Egyptian religion also blended into Roman beliefs. Roman writers described Egyptian gods and often connected them with their own. A new god, Serapis, was created by merging Osiris and Apis to unite Egyptians and Romans under one religion. The Nile was personified as the god Nilus, and Horus appeared as a falcon-headed Roman soldier. Even Alexander the Great claimed divine status as the son of Ammon after visiting the oracle at Siwa. But no Egyptian deity became more famous than Isis. Her worship spread far beyond Egypt, reaching across the Mediterranean into Europe. People made pilgrimages to her temple at Philae, and shrines dedicated to her appeared from the Greek island of Delos all the way to what is now Germany. Roman artists created works inspired by Egyptian style, mixing Roman and Nile influences. To the Romans, Egypt was a land that was exotic, spiritual, and fashionable, a place to rule, admire, and imitate all at once. When the Renaissance began, Egypt reappeared in the minds of Europeans, but mostly through the remains left behind by the Romans. In the 15th and 16th centuries, very few Europeans had ever been to Egypt. What they knew came secondhand, through Roman ruins and objects. The obelisks and statues they saw in European cities had actually been moved there by the Romans many centuries earlier. Ironically, what people thought was true Egypt was already a Roman version of it. Wealthy Europeans of the Renaissance eagerly mixed Egyptian designs into their own culture. Popes in Rome even re-erected ancient obelisks and gave them Christian meanings, using them as symbols of papal power, just as Roman emperors had used them to show imperial strength. At that time, no one could yet read hieroglyphs, so they were seen as mysterious symbols hiding secret wisdom. Scholars even created fake hieroglyphic alphabets that only looked Egyptian but actually represented European philosophical ideas. This helped fuel Europe's growing interest in secret knowledge and magic. Alchemists and mystics believed that Egypt held the world's deepest truths. The so-called Hermetic tradition, which claimed to come from the ancient sage Hermes Trismegistus, was thought to have Egyptian roots. Egypt, in their imagination, became less of a real country and more like a mythical library filled with ancient secrets waiting to be discovered. During the Enlightenment, Egypt's image changed again. It was no longer just mysterious, it was admired as the birthplace of science, law, and wisdom. Thinkers praised Egypt as the foundation of civilization itself. Wealthy travelers on Europe's grand tour didn't need to go all the way to Africa to experience it. They could see Egyptian monuments in Rome, read travelers' tales, and view Egypt-inspired art in libraries and galleries. By then, Egypt had become not just a faraway place but an idea, a symbol of ancient knowledge and human progress that lived on in Europe's imagination. The fascination with Egypt reached a new level in 1798, when Napoleon Bonaparte launched his campaign there. But this was not just a military mission, it was also a grand show of power, propaganda, and learning all rolled into one. France saw itself as the new Rome, and since Egypt had once been a Roman province, Napoleon believed it was the perfect place to conquer and study. Even though his army was defeated in the end, the cultural impact of the expedition was enormous. Along with soldiers, Napoleon brought over 100 scholars, artists, and engineers. Their detailed research was later published in a massive collection called Description de l'Égypte. It documented everything, from temples and monuments to plants, animals, and daily life, and when released, it amazed all of Europe. For the first time, Egypt wasn't just a legend, it was carefully mapped, drawn, and described. Then came one of the most important discoveries in history, the Rosetta Stone, found by French soldiers in 1799. This black granite slab contained the same message written in 3 different scripts: ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, Demotic, and ancient Greek. After Napoleon's defeat, the British took the stone, but it turned out to be priceless. It took many years, but in 1822, the French scholar Jean-François Champollion finally cracked the code of hieroglyphs. This breakthrough marked the birth of modern Egyptology, the scientific study of ancient Egypt. What had started as Napoleon's failed military adventure ended up reshaping Europe's view of Egypt forever. It turned ancient Egypt from a mysterious myth into a field of real study, but it also became a political competition. Britain and France soon fought not only for knowledge, but also for power over Egypt. By 1882, Britain had turned Egypt into a veiled protectorate, a polite term for colonial control. What had begun as fascination and research had now evolved into both a science and a symbol of empire. For many centuries, only kings, emperors, and the very rich could afford to travel to Egypt. But by the late 18th century, this began to change. Wealthy private explorers started organizing their own expeditions, not always for science, but often for fame and curiosity. These early travelers explored temples and tombs, making sketches and writing travel books that fascinated European readers. In the 19th century, tourism became an organized business. The British businessman Thomas Cook revolutionized travel by creating the first package tours. His company offered organized Nile cruises, guided visits, and comfortable accommodations that made Egypt more accessible to middle-class Europeans. By the 1880s, Cook's steamships controlled most of the tourist traffic along the Nile. What had once been a journey reserved for pharaohs, emperors, and scholars had now turned into an adventure for ordinary travelers who could afford a ticket. As tourism grew, Egypt itself became a product. World fairs and exhibitions in Europe built elaborate Egyptian-themed displays that amazed visitors. European cemeteries and public buildings began using Egyptian-style designs. Cities added obelisks to their squares. Meanwhile, museums in London and Paris competed to collect the most impressive Egyptian artifacts. But this craze had a dark side. Egypt's ancient treasures were being taken on a massive scale. Tomb raiding and illegal digging increased, and countless artifacts were removed from the country. One of the strangest results of this obsession was the mummy unwrapping party. In earlier centuries, mummies had already been used for bizarre purposes, ground up for medicine or for a paint pigment called mummy brown. But during the Victorian era, people began using them for entertainment. Imagine this, a crowded hall filled with smoke and candlelight. On a table lies a real Egyptian mummy. A surgeon begins cutting through the wrappings as an audience watches in awe. Gasps fill the room whenever an amulet or preserved hand appears. Sometimes these events were billed as scientific lectures, but other times they were simply dinner party entertainment. To some Victorians, this was a thrilling glimpse into ancient mystery. To others, it felt disrespectful, a strange mix of science, curiosity, and cruelty. As Egypt became more of a show, its history was treated less like sacred heritage and more like a spectacle for profit. Out of this fascination grew the legend of the mummy's curse, a dramatic story that turned Egypt's relics into symbols of danger and mystery, conveniently hiding the real issue of colonial theft. The biggest spark of Egyptomania came on November 4, 1922, when archaeologist Howard Carter, funded by Lord Carnarvon, made one of the most famous discoveries in history, the tomb of Tutankhamun. Peering through a small hole, Carter famously said that he saw wonderful things. Inside lay treasures untouched for more than 3,000 years. Unlike most royal tombs, which had already been robbed, Tutankhamun's resting place was almost completely intact, filled with gold, jewelry, statues, and sacred objects. It was a breathtaking window into ancient Egypt's royal past. Not long after the discovery, Lord Carnarvon died suddenly, and rumors spread of a mummy's curse. Newspapers quickly picked up the story, turning it into a worldwide sensation. By 1923 and 1924, when Carter finally opened the sarcophagus and revealed the boy king himself, the entire world was watching. The Times newspaper had exclusive rights to report on the excavation, and photographer Harry Burton's stunning, carefully staged photos made the event a global phenomenon. After the dark years of World War I, people were hungry for excitement and wonder, and Tutankhamun's tomb provided both. Egyptian styles began to influence everything: fashion, art, and design. Women's flapper dresses resembled the flowing lines seen in ancient Egyptian art. Short bobbed hairstyles echoed those of ancient queens. The Art Deco movement borrowed heavily from pharaonic shapes and motifs. Icons like Cleopatra and Isis were reimagined as symbols of feminine power and beauty. Tutmania swept across Europe and America. But for Egyptians themselves, the discovery had a much deeper meaning. The 1920s were a time of growing national pride and independence. To them, Tutankhamun wasn't just a treasure, he was a symbol of their ancient greatness and modern identity. Egyptian schools began teaching pharaonic history. Egyptian archaeologists took the lead in research and museum work, gradually replacing European control. Tutankhamun became a national icon, a bridge between Egypt's ancient glory and its modern awakening. Egyptomania, the fascination with ancient Egypt, often tells us more about the people who admired Egypt than about Egypt itself. For the Romans, Egypt reflected power and empire, a culture they conquered and proudly displayed as part of their greatness. For Renaissance and Enlightenment thinkers, Egypt symbolized mystery and ancient wisdom, a source of secret knowledge and lost science. For the Victorians, it became both a spectacle and a business, something to study, collect, and even use for entertainment. And in the 20th century, the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb turned Egypt into a global media sensation, feeding the modern world's hunger for wonder and beauty. But over time, this story of fascination began to shift. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb also allowed Egypt to reclaim its own history. What had once been controlled, interpreted, and displayed by outsiders became a source of national pride for Egyptians themselves. Ancient Egypt was no longer just Europe's dream, it became Egypt's own story again. So, Egyptomania is not only about how the world viewed Egypt, but also about Egypt's resilience, its ability to survive, inspire, and rise above centuries of misunderstanding and exploitation. And in truth, Egyptomania never really ended. From Hollywood movies like Cleopatra and the Mummy to the continuing popularity of Egyptian exhibitions around the world, the fascination still lives on. Ancient Egypt continues to serve as a mirror of modern desires, whether for glamour, mystery, or power. Its legacy remains timeless, influential, and uniquely its own.